Great. Thank you guys all for being on. As Allison said, we have a really good topic to discuss today. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Walk, who is the medical director at the University of Minnesota Fairview ALS Clinic. And he also has been an instrumental member of our local leadership council for a number of years. I guess I apologize. I don't know how many years, Dr. Walk, but has been a leadership council member for many years, as well as is currently serving for our national office on the clinical programs advisory board. So he is instrumental in kind of working with local clinics, making sure that they are meeting criteria to just make sure that we're providing the best care possible to those living with ALS. So I'm going to pass the mic to him, but just want to thank everyone for being here. And thank you, David Walk, for being part of this. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you. This came up because I'm sharing screen here, hopefully successfully. This came up because I had asked how we could publicize one of the studies for which we're recruiting. And Corey and I decided this could be one way to do it. So what we've done is to canvass our colleagues in our region. I don't know what our region means, but Minnesota, North Dakota, Wisconsin, Iowa is where we reached out to, I think we all know each other and have collegial relationships. So they were kind enough to share what they are doing in the realm of clinical research, and so this will be a kind of a high level overview, a bit of a summary of what's being done, and a little bit of a discussion about clinical research in ALS as well. And many of you are very familiar with this. Some of you may be less familiar with some of these points. I'll be relatively brief and would be happy to have a chat afterwards. So again, I'll start with just an overview of types of clinical research. I'm using that term to differentiate it from basic science research, where studies are being done in animals or yeast cells or stem cells or other sorts of non-human research, if you will. I will summarize current clinical research in ALS in our region as previously defined. And what I'm summarizing are currently enrolling or announced clinical research. So this is a moving target, right? There are trials, for example, that are close to full enrollment and will be closed to enrollment soon. There are numerous studies at the University of Minnesota, at the University of Wisconsin, a lot of places. Frederick got back and said, yeah, we also have several things that are in the works, not fully ready to recruit yet. So there will be a lot more coming on board in the next few months that I won't be speaking about, because we generally avoid doing that until something is actually fully ready to go. I'm intending an informational summary. I'm not providing endorsements of one study over another. I'm not providing results of things that haven't been completed. More information on any trial, study, effort that I'll be talking about can be obtained from the research coordinators who are working on them, and that a list of those individuals is provided at the end here. And Corey, I would assume that you would have a mechanism of getting that out to folks. So again, I want to keep it high level and somewhat agnostic, but also very informational. So let's start just by kind of talking about types of clinical research. This may be something of an arbitrary distinction, but I don't think it is. I'm going to talk about three things: translational research, data and biospecimen collection, and clinical trials. Translational research has formal definitions, but it's essentially determining or trying to learn more about the biology of a condition, and using what we know from the laboratory, what basic science research that I was speaking of earlier teaches us, seeing how it applies in people living with the condition, and conversely studying people living with the condition to learn more about that disorder so that we can find better treatments. Data and biospecimen collection is exactly what it sounds like. Again, we can learn more about a condition if we learn more about the people who are living with it. And that involves learning about their examinations, their symptoms, the changes in their condition over time, but also studying biofluids like spinal fluid or blood cells or skin cells, or tissue that's received in biopsies or autopsies or other mechanisms. That's very important in ALS. And then finally, clinical trials. And we'll talk about, I'll have a slide for each of the two subcategories, the placebo-controlled trials that we're all familiar with, in which some people in the study do not receive the intervention that's being studied, and some do, and we make a comparison between those two groups, and expanded access programs, which are becoming increasingly prevalent and important in ALS research in particular. So those are the three categories I'll speak of. And we'll start with translational ALS research in our region. So two things here, biomarker studies and IPS cell or iPSC studies. Biomarkers are critically important, and many of you know or have heard that one of the things that we desperately need in ALS is better biomarkers. And biomarkers are essentially some sort of biological evidence about an individual, their condition, or the effect of a treatment. So that could be something that we can find in the blood. That could be something we can find in spinal fluid. That could be some sort of imaging test. That could be any number of tests that we can do to learn about a variety of things, because there are different types of biomarkers. So for example, there are diagnostic biomarkers, things that tell us, is this the correct diagnosis? There are prognostic biomarkers, things that tell us, will this treatment likely help this person or that person? There are progression biomarkers that tell us more about how somebody's condition is changing over time. They kind of supplement what we know from an examination, for example. There are biomarkers of target engagement, which tell us that a treatment is actually going to the part of the body that we designed it to go to. So all of these are very important, and all of these are insufficient in ALS for the most part. There might be one exception. And so we need to get more better biomarkers. Both Mayo and the University of Minnesota are working on biomarker studies, Mayo in blood and spinal fluid, University currently in blood in a study that I'll reference in a subsequent slide, where we are trying to validate certain putative biomarkers, essentially taking a couple of blood tests that look very promising and putting them to the test and see how well they work in telling us about a person's condition with ALS. The other biomarker study that I wanted to talk about is the reason that was what I reached out to Corey about in the first place, is we're anxious to recruit for a study in which we're doing MRI biomarker testing. This is a protocol using an MRI of brain and spinal cord that was developed with previous studies that we did at the University of Minnesota, in which we found a combination of features on MRI scans that we feel are sensitive in identifying, first of all, that somebody has a condition affecting those cells in those areas, but also progression of the disease. And so we are funded for a multi-center study that's intended to try to mimic a clinical trial, without a treatment in this case, but to mimic a clinical trial and to see if this MRI protocol could show meaningful change over time in a group of people that would be about the same duration, the same entrance conditions, if you will, or what we call inclusion criteria, the same study size as a typical clinical trial. And if so, it could really help us learn another way of monitoring, does this drug work? In fact, we may even have some interventions that we'll be testing as a subset. The sites that are currently involved are University of Minnesota, with assistance from Health Partners and Hennepin Health, Northwestern University in Chicago, and University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. We are looking at people who have ALS and people who are neurologically healthy. And we're very interested in recruiting quickly for this. We'll simply be doing scans and obtaining blood at the first visit, 3 months, 6 months, and 12 months afterwards. And we recognize that in some people living with ALS, it becomes more difficult to tolerate an MRI. That's something that we certainly know. but that's kind of baked into our inclusion criteria. But that's one of the studies that we're anxious to recruit for quickly, and that kind of led to asking for something of a platform here. The others on this slide are what I labeled as iPSC studies. So as many of you know, um, we can't study in life the motor neurons in people living with ALS. They're deep inside some pretty important structures called brain and spinal cord. What we can study are neurons made from those people, which is rather remarkable, right? So with blood cells or cells from the skin, we can make stem cells from those people. And then from those stem cells, we can make neurons or nerve cells, brain or spinal cord neurons. And then we can study those and compare them with cells made from people who don't have ALS. And that's being done in a lot of places. Johns Hopkins has been the leader in this. Both Mayo and the University of Minnesota are doing studies with that sort of technology. Mayo's study is with cells from people with genetically determined or familial ALS. Ours is comparing cells taken from people who have ALS and cells taken from people who have PLS to try to better understand the distinction between those two and why PLS might protect spinal motor neurons, whereas ALS doesn't. Mayo, I believe, is recruiting for tissue. I believe it is skin cells for this. Currently, our study has the samples we need, but we may be recruiting more from another study over time going forward. So those are what I'm calling translational ALS studies in the region that we learned about when we asked around. Second category, you'll recall, data and biospecimen collection. So these are efforts to learn about ALS over time, longitudinally, from people living with ALS. A lot of these are site-specific, enrolling people who are coming to individual clinics. So low-hanging fruit, scientifically, is the fact that ALS clinics are examining people living with ALS. They're asking them questions. They're testing their breathing. They're testing their blood as part of routine clinical care. And it has seemed for quite some time like this is very valuable information that could be utilized to understand the disease better. So there have been several independent efforts to do that. Essentia in Duluth is involved in MOVER, which is the Muscular Dystrophy Association's effort to gather clinical data from ALS clinics. Hennepin Health has been involved for years with CREATE, which is a wonderful consortium that's NIH funded, doing some very, very important science with blood, urine, biospecimens, and information obtained from people in participating clinics who are coming to be seen in participating clinics. At the University of Minnesota, about a decade ago, we started what we call the ALS Natural History Study, which now has I guess 9 sites in the US and a few overseas, and has gathered data from 2,700 people living with ALS that has been used to help design clinical trials and to learn more about the progression of this disease. We also now have FDA funding for blood collection to store cells to be used as stem cells, to look at biomarkers, which we're currently doing. We're testing new potential biomarkers, and to do genetic testing to contribute to the growing international library of genetic information to help us understand why certain people get ALS. Those three are kind of fundamental efforts to understand the disease better, and that are being recruited almost universally or almost only from people coming to those particular clinics. I will say that CREATE has enrolled some people with related conditions who aren't at the Hennepin Clinic. And the Health Partners is doing something really interesting to me, because I think of quality of life as such an individual thing and sometimes a moving target. They have created a registry called their Hope ALS QOL registry, in which they are learning from people living with ALS coming to their clinic about how they define and perceive quality of life over the course of their condition. And I think that could be really, really important because not only do we want to find better treatments, we also want to ask people how we can make their lives better um, uh, while they're living with ALS. Also, a site-specific study. Enrolling more broadly, I have two things listed. One, many of you are probably familiar with all ALS. I'll mention the Minnesota ALS Biorepository first and then go back to all ALS. Senator Tomassoni, many of you are familiar with his courageous efforts to help us in Minnesota do more, both to help people living with ALS and to learn more about the condition. One of the studies that his efforts at the legislature funded is a biorepository to do the sorts of things, the sorts of work we've been talking about, and to recruit from places that are not currently recruiting for data, or in this case, particularly fluid and tissue repository. To date, we've been using it to provide a kind of a foundational funding for obtaining brain and spinal cord for research purposes from people who generously offered that donation in autopsy after death. And so that's really provided us the foundational funding we need to be able to do that on a broader scale. But it will also be used for other blood or spinal fluid collections, particularly when they're obtained in the clinical setting. Why have them thrown out, right, when we can use them for research? So I mentioned all ALS a moment ago. Many of you may have heard about this. This is a massive federally funded project to reach out to people who do not qualify or are not in a region where some of these other data and specimen collection studies are active. So for example, I mentioned ALS natural history. That's only 10 centers in the US, and there are, 100 or more ALS clinics in the US. So all ALS is an ambitious effort to learn from everybody in the US who has ALS and isn't already involved in a previous study that's doing the same sort of work. And that will be a collection about their disease process, their other medical history. They will be using digital health technology, so things like biosensors, periodic voice recordings, and blood, spinal fluid collection, which can be done at home because, again, if the effort is to be national and reach everybody, you can't, be obtaining your samples only at major academic medical centers. And so that's one of the great things about all ALS, and we'll be making a very concerted effort. In fact, I was just speaking with folks in Montana, a very concerted effort to reach out to places where there is less active research so that we can be as inclusive as possible. And so that's what we're doing locally in data and biospecimens. And then finally, clinical trials. And first, a kind of a preliminary slide. I'm realizing I should have this in a different view. That's fine. Many of you may be familiar with this, but I'm going to go through it briefly. Clinical trials, or studies designed to test a potential treatment's effectiveness in a condition, have several stages. Phase 1 is usually first in human. It's the first time that something is being tested in people. And as you can imagine, they're very closely monitored studies with small numbers of people, 10 to 20 people perhaps. Sometimes the first in human is healthy individuals who volunteer. In ALS, more often than not, it's people living with ALS. And again, they're very, very small studies. They're only going to involve a handful of participating centers because obviously you want to move slowly and be careful. What you're going to hear more about, of course, are phase 2 and phase 3. And this has become something of a continuum, I will say. So you'll hear me referring to something that's being billed as a 2B/3 study. Often phase 2 studies are sometimes called 2A or 2B, depending upon the size. There is a movement to develop adaptive trial designs where you can change the design as more information comes in and expand the same study from a phase 2 if the data are looking promising to a phase 3. So these distinctions are getting blurred, and even phase 4, which I'll mention in a moment, in a way can almost be like a 3B. But essentially, phase 2 are a little smaller than phase 3, but both are generally only in people with the condition, and are looking for some evidence of efficacy, of effectiveness, in addition to further safety monitoring. Historically, phase 3 has been a larger study that is designed to be um, good enough, large enough, sensitive enough, so that if the intervention being studied is effective, you'll be able to determine that with sufficient evidence and sufficient quality that you can go to a regulatory authority like the FDA in this country, and say, here's our data. Would you approve this drug? That's really what phase 3 is intended to do. And there's a lot of complexity in terms of the measures that are used, the statistics that go into determining if something is large enough, long enough, who do you involve in them. That's a whole nother fascinating discussion. Phase 4, as you can see, is post-marketing. That could be something kind of informal, as has happened in the past. So, for example, after Riluzole was approved in the 1990s, there have been numerous efforts to try to get a better sense in the real world with real world data, as we call it, or real world evidence, um, as to how well it works. And actually, those studies have suggested that Riluzole may actually work better, for the most part, they've shown that, work better than was originally thought. Um, Radicava, the same thing happened. The FDA actually required the manufacturer to do post-marketing studies. And now we also have certain provisional approvals of drugs, which happened with Relyvrio. Relyvrio looked good enough in phase 2B that it was approved, but the FDA said, I know you have phase 3 trials that are ongoing. Um, so let's see what those show. But for now, the drug is approved. And unfortunately, the phase 3 trial did not show adequate benefit to allow it to stay on the market. So again, you can see that these all have very specific definitions, but we're running into a world where there's more of a continuum between phase 2, 3, and even post-marketing. Finally, expanded access programs. Many of you are familiar with that, but I'll just speak about them briefly. I think that's really been a valuable kind of new player in this scene. I describe expanded access as a clinical trial for people who don't qualify for clinical trials. And that's essentially what it is. Because of the interest of many people living with ALS as well as other conditions in participating in research, when so many of the studies have very limited criteria, an interest amongst scientists and physicians in understanding more about how something works in a broader population and not just a very narrow population in a clinical trial, and an interest amongst manufacturers, say in the drug world, in getting more data, more information about the safety of their product, and again, how it might work in the full population and not just a narrow range. Expanded access was born. And so these are being offered in several circumstances. Caveats are that again, to be in expanded access, one needs to not qualify for an available placebo-controlled trial. And the other really important caveat is that the sponsor has to make a decision that they want to have an expanded access program. One cannot, dial up anything or anyone and say, I'd like to try this, if it's not available to be tried. Um, so the number of expanded access programs is limited by the number of sponsors or manufacturers who have the funding and the interest in making such a program available. Okay, so after all of that talking, let's get to the placebo-controlled clinical trials in our region. Many of you may be familiar with these. Hennepin Health has been conducting a trial with ibutolast, which has been studied in smaller studies in ALS. That did show some benefit. It's an anti-inflammatory mechanism of action. I believe it's a Japanese company that's developed it. These studies sometimes have acronym names. They're usually ridiculous names, and combat, I think, is a ridiculous name, but I forget what it's an acronym for. I call it the ibutolast study. That is a phase 2b3. So it's basically large enough that if very effective, they're hoping to be able to present it for a registration. It's been going on for a little while because it has very restrictive inclusion criteria. Masitinib is a medication that is believed to have several anti-inflammatory mechanisms as well, but very differently from ibutylast. Was studied in Europe with some encouraging results and is now in a large phase 3 trial in North America. Um, these things kind of ebb and flow. There have been times that we've had 5 or 6 recruiting at once. Right now, we only have 2 recruiting at once. But the other biggie, which I guess I should shift tab there, um, in this space is the platform trial. And again, you may be familiar with that. This is designed wisely as a platform, a way of designing one study that can be used for multiple drugs. It's like going from, you know, um, the Redstone and Atlas rockets to the space shuttle. It's kind of a recyclable study, and that has allowed uh, acceleration in the speed of testing drugs. These are all phase 2. They're not first in human, but they're often the first after a first in human. So they're early phase trials. And the platform trial has 72. They may have expanded to 75 sites throughout, I believe, just the US. Not certain of that. Um, so there's a lot of ability to move things through quickly. And they are about to start regimen H. H is the 8th letter of the alphabet, so they've already completed 7 trials. There are several sites in our region that participate, but again, right now we've got a little bit of a lull, and the platform trial is between regimens. I should say, which I didn't mention earlier, as many of you are aware, almost all of these also have what's called an active treatment extension phase, which means that if you complete the study and choose to do so, you can stay in the study, but guaranteed to be on the intervention that's being tested. So in a way, it's kind of like an expanded access kind of grafted onto a placebo-controlled trial. All right, so that's what's happening locally in placebo-controlled trials. Expanded access has expanded, and there are a few that are going to be coming down the pike very soon in our region as well. But as of today, these are the ones that are recruiting. And again, one needs to not fulfill inclusion criteria for the placebo-controlled studies to qualify. But the qualifications are broad beyond that, so that a person whose condition is, very severely impaired could still qualify. And the other thing to say about expanded access programs is these are drugs that have already been studied at the phase 2 level. A lot is known about them. There's a lot of good safety data. And because of that, and because of the nature of expanded access, where you're recruiting people whose condition is more advanced oftentimes, um, the burden on the participant is much less. So it might be, one visit every 3 months. It might be one visit a year with a lot of remote data collection or blood draws. So the expanded access programs um, require less of the person participating. The placebo-controlled studies uh, can be burdensome, and I always make the point that a person who participates um, is doing so to help us learn more, to help everybody. Um, it's a really significant commitment uh, for which we're quite grateful. And conversely, when making that commitment, one has to recognize that they are committing to a fair amount of effort while they're struggling with a difficult disease. Expanded access is a little bit easier. So these 3 that you're seeing here have kind of distinct differences. CNMAU8 was studied in a previous platform trial, as well as a smaller study in Australia. It seems to have various neuroprotective properties. It's likely to be quite safe. They have not gone for approval because I don't know that they have the data to merit it at this point, but were some encouraging readouts in earlier studies. So the company has reported that they're planning a phase 3 trial, but unless or until that happens, actually while that happens, they do have expanded access at several sites. Currently, the only site in our region is University of Iowa. I think that's likely to, oh, I'm sorry. No, I believe that's also at Ascension Duluth as well. I think that was an oversight. Um, so I apologize for that. I see that's the thing about having it in the wrong mode. This way I can edit in real time. Um, yeah, I'm pretty sure well, you could speak with the folks up there. I may have been correct in not including it. I just thought that they were going in that direction. RAPA 501 um, uh, is currently only at University of Iowa. It's a very interesting approach. Again, there are inflammatory mechanisms in ALS. It's not a primary inflammatory disease like lupus, but there are inflammatory mechanisms. And in this, they are actually removing, by apheresis, they're removing the inflammatory cells of interest from people living with ALS, treating them to change their what we call phenotype, to make them function differently, and then reinfusing so that your, inflammatory, a certain category of your inflammatory lymphocytes act differently. So it's a really interesting approach. Um, and again, that will be confident in more sites in the region, certainly around the country, with time. Predopidine has already kind of made a splash, as you can see it throughout the region. That is another drug that was studied in the platform trial, another drug in which the manufacturer is saying that they are considering a phase 3 trial. At the moment, however, have been pretty aggressive in providing it through expanded access. Okay. So these are the people who matter, to reach out to. Many of sites like ours embed, it's kind of an odd term, but we embed our research coordinator in clinic so that everybody living with ALS who we see as a patient has an opportunity to learn how they could become a participant. And we do make an effort to educate people about other trials at other locations in the Twin Cities. In fact, I'm going to take a moment. Corey's heard me say this 1,000 times, but we take some pride in the fact that and people should know this, at least in the Twin Cities, we do work collaboratively. So a neurologist at Hennepin might be one of the investigators in a study at University of Minnesota. A neurologist at University of Minnesota might be one of the investigators at Hennepin, or health partners at U of M. We do believe strongly that we're all colleagues in research, even if our institutions are kind of nominally, you know, um, uh, um, in competition, for patients in a broader sense. So we get to know each other pretty well, and the coordinators are the people who identify, who educate, and who help us recruit for these studies. So Corey, again, you'll be able to distribute this list, right? Okay. Again, something that many of you know, and I'm sure there are others that I have not included. Um, but the federal government requires that any interventional study be listed in clinicaltrials.gov. I used to kind of do a little bit of an eye roll and say it's not that user friendly. To be honest, it's not that hard to get familiar with. And the great thing about it is it's comprehensive. And so you can log on. All you have to do is type in clinicaltrials.gov and you're in, and you just put in the name of the condition, and you can filter. You can put, actively recruiting, interventional, observational, the type of trial or study that you're interested in. You can, as I say, you can put in actively recruiting so you don't get a list of 100 things that are closed or not opened yet. I believe, I'm not certain, but you certainly could put in certain institutions if you can't put in certain regions. Um, so that's a great resource. ALS.net is a little bit more user-friendly, and it is on the ALS TDI website. Well, ALS.net is their website, and then they have a link to research, as does the ALS Association website. So there are ways to find out what's happening. Not all of these are always completely and totally up to date, to be perfectly honest, but they do list the research coordinator. So again, you could call and say, are you still recruiting, or are you recruiting yet for this particular study? And then Corey, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to talk about My Tomorrows.
Absolutely. Yes, and I'm sorry I was not able to unmute fast enough, but we will be including this information in our follow-up email, as well as it will be available in the recording. So My Tomorrows is a new initiative from the ALS Association where we have partnered with My Tomorrows, which is a company that has opportunities on ALS clinical research across the United States. So what happens with this is if you do go on the My Tomorrows website, which is linked down at the bottom, thank you, Allison, you will be able to put in some interest information, some background information, and a personalized patient navigator will reach out to you and just kind of get like an overview of where you are at in the disease process, as well as any information that they would need to get from the clinic. They can work with the clinic neurologist and the team to get additional information. But what they're able to do then is match you up to certain clinical trials that you would qualify for across the United States. So I think the big piece of this, I have not, this is rather new, just FYI. So this is something that we've just recently launched. And I think the big thing about this is that we're really hoping that having that patient navigator will really help individuals find specific clinical trials that will work for them. And I also like to hear that they're going to be in touch with your local clinic team as well. So,
And I'll add one more thing, which is a shout out for ALS ambassadors. A remarkable guy named Rick Bedlack, some of you know about Rick, who runs the ALS clinic um, at Duke. And in fact, he was the neurologist who came to Minneapolis to certify our clinic many years ago. Rick has created a remarkable program called ALS Ambassadors, or the program has a different name, but what he does is educate people living with ALS who are motivated. I mean, these are energetic humans, motivated to be a resource for other people living with ALS, which is phenomenal. So that they learn about, most of course have participated in clinical research, but they learn about all the things we're talking about, how clinical research proceeds, what the expectations are, what the burdens are for participants. And so they are available for questions when somebody's considering participating in ALS research. Um, and you know, Corey, I think you could probably access them through the Niels website, which is NEALS. Uh,
yeah,
but there might
I was just pulling that up, so I will pop that into our chat as well.
great. And again, these are remarkable people. Um, you know, when you consider what they're living with, and they are reaching out to others. So it's a great program. Um, that's all I got.